There actually is. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Steve Ventura. Steve's a pretty well-known face here on campus. He's the Gaylord Nelson Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Soil Science, quite a mouthful, Director of LICGF, the Land Information and Computer Graphics Facility, and also Director of the Land Tenure Center in the Nelson Institute. He has MS and PhD degrees from the Nelson Institute in environmental monitoring and land resources. He's an expert in land information systems, LIS, and geographic information systems, GIS, on a whole range of issues, including land management, resource protection, water quality, critical habitat, agricultural conservation, precision ag, and land records modernization, amongst other things. And also teaches courses in GIS, environmental impact assessment, and also senior capstone courses in soil science and environmental studies. So Steve is here today to present our first keynote address. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Howard. I guess we'll go with the mic. So I actually started the late lamented environmental monitoring program, which was a remote sensing and GIS program, in January of 1981, which by my calculations means that I've been doing this for exactly 33 1/3 years. I don't know if that means I get to reminisce for a while or ramble incoherently for a while. Maybe a combination of both of those. Bring the lights down a little bit. Is that possible to track? So nominally, what I'm going to talk about is urban agriculture and some of the spatial analysis that goes into that. I want to start off a little bit, though, for those of you that have been born after that 33 1/3 years, to talk a little bit about the bad old days. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about why I have become interested in urban agriculture in particular. And then talk about a case study in urban agriculture. Really, I came here motivated by the use of spatial technologies in agriculture. I had spent a number of years in and around agriculture. So I came here to do remote sensing, and in fact spent my first 3 summers hanging my head out the belly hole of an airplane up in the central sands, taking pictures of potato fields to understand the patterns of disease. And that technology was adopted and is still used by growers up in that area, primarily to monitor the health of the crops that they're growing. This also involved spectral radiometry to try to understand what the spectral reflectance curves were. In 1981, there was not a field-based spectral radiometer. There were only laboratory instruments, so I got out my 51 Chevy pickup truck and a 30-foot extension ladder and a generator in the back of the truck, and climbed up on that ladder and used a laboratory-based instrument. So this is an encouragement to you graduate students that where there is a will, there is a way. We can make things work. Fortunately for my as yet unborn children, the next year there was a field-based radiometer made by Spectron Instruments and continued to work. The bulk of the 80s I spent on this project, the Dane County Soil Erosion Control Plan. That was actually my dissertation work. The state required every county in the state to develop a soil erosion control plan. Most counties simply went to the paper records and put these together based on by guess and by golly. Here in Dane County, we began digitizing soils maps. And in fact, the Surgo data that you know and love today has its origins in techniques that were developed down in the basement of Steenbach Library. Perfected the scanning technologies and the raster to vector conversion process and so forth, and that ultimately led to the nationwide digitizing of what were then paper records. This is just a little comparison. There's still a lot of time-consuming, tedious work going into digitizing, but we do have a record that, again, can be traced back to work that was originally done here. Ultimately led to the what I believe is the first ever county-wide resource management plan in using remote sensing and GIS about the late 80s. This soil erosion control planning project was associated with kind of a partner with the Dane County Land Records Project. A couple of years ago, Ben Neiman came here and talked about this project. It also created a number of trends, if you will, including this iconic diagram that shows up in lots and lots and lots of different places now to explain the core concepts of GIS and the layer basis for it. That, believe it or not, is a GPS receiver, circa 1984, I believe. The technology has evolved a little bit since then. The time and cost savings and positioning, of course, are phenomenal at this point. Jumping up to the 1990s, one of the innovations that came from here was the use of GIS for agricultural land management, piloted in the Arlington Agricultural Research Station, again, circa mid-90s. Again, something that has spread quite widely across the country at this point. Switching gears. I have become quite interested and involved with urban agriculture, and there's some motivations for that. The motivations are primarily understanding the issues and the problems associated with our standard, what some people call industrial agriculture. So the middle part of this talk is, how we go from mad cow to happy cow, how we look at some alternatives here. So as I say, agriculture in this country, at least most of the food that ends up on our tables comes out of this standard industrial model. Henry Ford created the process to produce lots and lots of cars, and it has some consequences. And similarly, we have this bucolic idea of agriculture in this country, but the reality is much more like this. And there are some consequences to the way we produce food here. And I'm going to very quickly go through all of these. This talk is not about the consequences of agriculture, but I do want to understand that there is some motivation for thinking about food production in and near cities, more locally produced food and so forth. Everyone's familiar with soil erosion, causes problems both locally and long distances. Everyone's heard of the dead zone, probably, an area in the Gulf of Mexico that has anoxic conditions that result in major fish kills and so forth. Monocultures, the planting of vast acreages of the same genetic material, has problems associated with it, not just the aesthetic blight that you see here, but problems with pest resistance, problems with loss of diversity in the gene pool, loss of the quality of the food. We all know that it's probably not even worth buying a tomato in the middle of the winter because it's going to be hard and green tasting. This kind of agriculture requires lots of pesticides, and when pesticides aren't hitting the target organisms, they are poisons. They are causing problems with beneficial insects, causing problems to workers, causing all kinds of problems with animals and people and so forth. Some of you may be familiar with colony collapse disorder, also known as the bee rhapsody. It's a real problem, and Wisconsin is suffering from it, the agriculture is suffering from it, and there's pretty good evidence that it's associated with the poisons that we use in agricultural production.
Is that a real tortoise?
That is a real picture, yes. The pests evolve resistance to these poisons. The chart on the right is showing that this little guy, the Colorado potato beetle, is now resistant to over 50 different kinds of agricultural chemicals. We're creating super weeds, insert the genes for Roundup resistance into our crops. Those genes drift into the weeds. The weeds are then also resistant to our agricultural chemicals. These weeds in a cotton field just simply can't be controlled by any of the chemicals that we have available to us. Changes the character of our communities. The mega farms just buy directly from a factory rather than going down to the local seed dealer or the local hardware store. Our communities end up looking pretty much the same across the board. Agriculture is implicated in greenhouse gases. These are 3 different analyses with different assumptions, ranging from about 1/4 to 1/3 of the greenhouse gases can in some way be attributed to our food production. The same process that leads to pesticide resistance also leads to antibiotic drug resistance. About 3/4 of the antibiotics used in this country are used in animal agriculture, and 70% of those are used simply as growth promoters. They're not even used to treat diseases, they're used to make animals grow faster. So, half the antibiotics that we use in this country aren't even used to treat disease. And that leads to drug resistance and significant problems, particularly in our places of public health, such as hospitals.
What condition was it?
That's a staph infection, flesh-eating bacteria as they're known. Animal welfare, I call it a moral question with environmental implications. A animal feedlot with 10,000 head of cattle is producing the same amount of waste as a city of 80,000 people. That city of 80,000 people, of course, has a wastewater treatment plant. The farm feedlot, the CAFO, simply takes it and spreads it out on the land, often very much untreated. And then there's the corporate control issues. I'm not going to get into the legal details here, but the large corporations, both the chemical companies and large seed companies, go to extreme legal measures to protect their what are quite often somewhat monopolistic interests in the production methods. This has implications for our food systems as well. We essentially have an unbalanced diet, and we have unbalanced emphasis. On the right is what USDA says we should be eating. On the left is the minuscule investment that USDA makes in those healthy foods that they're suggesting we should be eating. Leads to issues of food security. Access to healthy, nutritious food is quite limited in some areas. This is probably a good time to pause for a GIS aside. This is an analysis that's done at the county level, and we see Menominee County showing up in Wisconsin and Grant County showing up in Wisconsin. Guess what this would look like if we looked at the, for example, the census tract level. Milwaukee, Green Bay, Rockford, where we have smaller communities, quite often impoverished communities that are the most food insecure segments of our population. This is a lot of words, a lot of statistics that basically says we eat too much of the wrong food, right? It makes us sick. We have a public health crisis in obesity that can be substantially attributable to our food system. Okay? And the same populations that are at risk from running out of money at the end of the week or the month and being hungry are also the populations that mostly have access to poor quality food, high calories, low value food. So, what are the alternatives? Very briefly touch on 3 different approaches. Changing mainstream agriculture, the so-called sustainable ag movement, and then this thing that Will Allen calls the good food revolution, looking at our urban areas. So we can do better with conventional agriculture, use a number of different approaches. We can take a harder look at how our federal and state public resources in agriculture are being distributed. As you know, the federal farm bill discussions are predominated by discussions of SNAP, the food stamp program, and there really is not nearly as much attention to the kinds of things that are going to be steering the way agriculture is produced. We certainly know how to do a better job in soil conservation. Lots and lots of different techniques have been known for 70, 80, 90 years. We can do a better job in understanding pest pressures and fine-tuning the use of agricultural chemicals. Precision agriculture potentially offers the ability to do variable rate application depending on conditions. We have the technologies to do a much better job with our waste management, anaerobic digesters, composting systems, and so forth. So these technologies all exist. It really is a matter of making the investments. We can use market signals to alter conventional agriculture. This is up in the Central Sands where there's a program known as Healthy Grown Potatoes. These potato growers get to put this label and the World Wildlife Fund Panda on their potatoes if they agree to a set of protocol for pesticide reduction. These growers are using less potent chemicals and about 30% less chemicals altogether when they participate in this program. Sustainable agriculture, actually, let me just flip back very briefly. Provide this contrast. Old white guys standing around a field demonstration. Sustainable agriculture. Young people, women, people of color that want to find forms of agriculture that are meeting what is now known as the triple bottom line. Environmental improvements, viable for the farmers themselves and socially acceptable. Again, a lot of different approaches that we can use here. Certainly diversifying the crop base. We can use for our animals something known as management intensive rotational grazing, moving the animals from small paddock to small paddock so that they actually improve the quality of the pasture over time. Just as an aside on this one, and this comes to our land records analysis, Wisconsin has something called value taxation. It provides a property tax reduction for farmers in order to maintain their viability in agriculture, particularly where land values are driven by development pressures. These are 2 parcels side by side on the landscape, pretty much the same kind of parcel. The taxes for this parcel are $65 a year. Taxes for this parcel are $2,100 a year. Why? Because this guy is turning some cattle out into these woods and he gets agricultural use value property tax assessment. The conservationists tell us, no, don't turn the cattle out in the woods, they're gonna create erosion and compact the soil. And the foresters tell us, no, don't turn the cattle out in the woods, they're gonna ruin the timber stand value and they're gonna eat all the hardwood saplings. But our perverse property tax system nonetheless has that component in it. I have a student by the name of Keith Keeley, who will be starting a PhD program in environment resources that will be looking at whether we can accept that use value taxation, but use a technique known as silvopasturing to improve the woods. Okay? Instead of just turning the cattle loose and letting them high grade whatever they want to, let's use these management intensive rotational grazing techniques to figure out that very short period of the year when we can turn cattle out there, let them eat the bad stuff, the bramble, the prickly ash, and so forth, and hopefully improve the quality of the woods rather than degrade it over time, as long as we're stuck with this perverse disincentive for proper management of our woodlands. Sustainable agriculture in some cases means organic production, not your vision perhaps of organic production, but really large volumes. Many of you know Organic Valley. It is now a billion-dollar company producing lots and lots of food on a nationwide basis. Sustainable ag also is connected to our communities. The Madison area is fortunate to have something called the Fair Share CSA Coalition, one of the oldest and strongest such organizations in the country that continues to provide a very valuable connection between farmers and their community. Finally, there's this notion of local and urban production. This is, of course, Will Allen, the chief farmer and executive of Growing Power in Milwaukee. I've had the good fortune to work with him on a research project known as the Community and Regional Food Systems Project. A bunch of people involved with it. You need to go into details there. This is a USDA-supported project. Again, a bunch of words here that basically say we have a problem with food security, particularly in our inner cities, people of color, people of lower income, and the children are, of course, the most vulnerable to the issues that we're dealing with. As another aside, one of the first questions that comes up is, so local is cool, we like to support farmers. Can it produce enough food, though? Can we feed 9 billion people in the world? It's probably the wrong question. It's a bit of a red herring, but we can do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation. We have 500,000 people in Dane County, and on average, they should be eating about 2,000 calories a day. We probably consume more like 2,300, but that's an aside. So if we take corn, and you can think about Cheetos that are cornmeal and corn sugar fried in corn oil sprinkled with cheese from corn-fed cows. That's your diet. I don't know if I'd want to live on Cheetos alone, but anyway, just looking at this from a caloric standpoint, corn has 400 calories per pound. There's 56 pounds per bushel, 180 bushels per acre on average in Dane County. So we can produce 4 million calories per acre. And I won't go through all of the math here, but essentially an acre of land in Dane County will feed 6 people. So we need 90,000 acres with this corn diet. We can go through similar kinds of calculations with soybeans. We can go through similar kinds of calculations with beef. We can go through similar calculations with fruits and vegetables, figuring out how many calories per acre if farmers were willing and interested in doing this. So if we have a diet that's, a quarter corn, beans, beef, and fruits and vegetables, we need about 140,000 acres to feed Dane County. So in Dane County, we actually have something like 400,000 acres of farmland currently in production. So if we simply look at this from a caloric standpoint and change the nature of what farmers are growing, we can not only feed Dane County, we can feed all of Milwaukee as well, simply by what's the land base of Dane County. So this really, I'm making some major assumptions here about distribution and seasonality and so forth. But I think the point is that we could change the way we're producing food and do a much better job on this food security issue. Anyway, back to this project. 3 components: education, outreach, research. The research has an academic component and it has an applied component, trying to figure out what works, what is innovative in urban agricultural production. This is the wonky academic side of it. For the time being, we can look at what is known as the food system or the food chain, starting with land, ag production, distribution, food processing, marketing, preparation, consumption, and then recycling back through the waste stream. There's lots of interesting things going on in production. I can quickly flip through this stuff. Backyard gardens, I talked about community-supported agriculture. We have here one of the biggest and most famous farmers markets right around the Capitol. Hoop houses and greenhouses are extending the season that we can produce food, as are things like floating row covers, varieties that are specifically adapted to longer seasons. I get spinach year-round that's grown right outside of Verona, not in a heated greenhouse. Okay? It's grown in a hoop house that's simply set up to do this season extension. There are ways of getting more out of our recycled materials. Vermicomposting, in a sense, concentrates the nutrients that are in our material. Aquaponics is a technique for recycling waste between fish and plants. There are space-intensive techniques. Will Allen has a dream of a vertical farm. People are growing on rooftops and other kinds of spaces like that. I recently read about a former Navy warehouse outside of Brooklyn, New York, that has 5 acres of rooftop gardens on it now. Now, I don't want to contemplate the weight bearing that's required for that and the water and soil that has to be moved, but it's happening. There are innovations in food processing and quality control, things like incubator kitchens. These women, maybe 1 week a year, have the ingredients for their homemade salsa, but they need a USDA certified stainless steel kitchen in order to sell it commercially. Well, they shouldn't have to bear the couple $100,000 that's needed to do that. They should be able to have access to a kitchen, for a few days. Food hubs. If we have a lot of small growers that can all bring their food to one location, then large wholesale operations can distribute it back out through the supermarkets. There's good things going on in markets and marketing. Some of you may be familiar with the Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin program, encouraging this kind of production and consumption. Interestingly, urban agriculture is quite unique in its philosophical underpinnings. Not everyone that's growing food in cities is motivated simply by commercial purposes, not simply motivated by making money. Many of them are doing it for other motivations: job training, youth employment, neighborhood revitalization, community-focused kinds of activities. And so we're seeing new business models. We're seeing new forms of organization in order to encourage this kind of activity. Food policy councils perhaps being one of the more important ones. And finally, we have issues of land in urban agriculture. And I'm going to spend a bit of time with this because obviously when we're talking about land, then we are talking about the use of geospatial technologies, both in land access and in land suitability. And what I want to do is provide a brief overview of a project that agroecology student Francis Eanes did with me a couple of years ago, looking here in Madison. Lots to plots, looking at issues of land availability for community gardens. So in 2011, the city of Madison adopted a sustainability plan that, among other things, said that we support existing community gardens and want to find places to establish new ones. And by the year 2020, the city of Madison would like to have 4% of its land base in gardens or other kinds of food production. So Francis noted that there's a lot of vacant land in the city, both public and private. You know, for example, along some of the bike corridors. The former rail corridors are quite often wide, and the bikes only need a couple of meters of width for their paths. So what he did was a land evaluation, first of all from existing public records. Just got the City of Madison parcel database, used a set of criteria to find about 3,600 parcels that were open, currently undeveloped, and not conflicted, not owned by a developer, not something that wouldn't be realistic to put a garden in. And then did some further refinement of that and actually went out and looked with a group of undergraduate students at about 1,300 parcels around the city to do the ground truthing. Does it have access to water? Are the sunlight conditions okay from buildings or trees? Is it big enough? Does it have vehicle access? Is it in scrub, or is it open enough that someone could contemplate gardening there? Is it safe? Are there nearby land use conflicts and so forth? And then from that list, he did narrowed it down to 640 parcels and did what would be called a phase 1 site assessment. This is essentially land contamination analysis based on existing records. Not doing soil sampling, but just looking at available records such as the historical insurance rate maps, the DNR's remediation tracking system, EPA databases on the toxic release inventory system, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, and so forth. So from that, he came up with a set of candidates. This is just an example on the near west side of town, how this candidate list might be used. One of the areas that was identified was Rennebaum Park near the DOT building. The Park Commission is doing some rethinking, replanning about how that space is allocated. And so what we can do is identify areas during the course of this planning process that are potentially suitable for a community garden in this area. I guess these two slides are out of order. The 640 parcels also went through a validation process, looking at a comparison to existing gardens. Did the criteria we used match that? We talked to about a dozen different experts in the development and siting of community gardens, and a survey of a couple hundred existing community gardeners about the kinds of criteria that they would use in selecting a garden site, and essentially affirmed that the criteria that were used in the GIS-based analysis matched their own perception of the kinds of sites that would be suitable for a community garden. This is what it looks like across the city. 1,000 acres, about a 2-acre average parcel size, representing 1 1/3% of Madison's land base. 2/3 of it's already in public ownership. The rest of it is typically large institutional grounds, companies, churches, and so forth. this can then be used by a variety of different people, motivated citizens, schools, planners, and so forth. And it is set up in a ArcGIS database, still an orphan at this point, but hopefully someone will pick it up and maintain it over time. So that's pretty much the story of agriculture and the use of spatial technologies. I guess you can ask, what you can do. Take Michael Pollan's advice, or join a movement, or just do what Bob says. Don't worry about a thing. Right? One piece of movement that I'm particularly excited about is actually something called the Institute for Urban Agriculture and Nutrition. We're working with 7 universities, Growing Power, the city of Milwaukee, to create this thing. Hopefully it will blossom forth in the next year. And with that, I will take questions.
Yes, I'm just wondering about the use of drones in research on these land parcels and all of that. What do you project for these uses, and could there be some catastrophic implications of many drones being used for agricultural purposes?
I wish that we had drone technology 30 years ago when I was on top of a 30-foot ladder. I do see a role for it, and in fact, there are commercial growers in California that are using drones for monitoring crop condition. So there is potentially a use for them in particularly in high-value crops. Whether there are darker implications, I guess that has to do with your level of paranoia. I think that there certainly are possibilities for intrusive use of drones. Hopefully our regulatory process will be on top of that.
Well, I'm thinking birds as well, that could affect migratory patterns and all of that.
Good, yeah. If there's lots and lots of them, I suppose that's a possibility. Yes, sir.
The example that you showed of the 2 land parcels in Crawford County, does the significantly higher assessment on the forested patch, does that assume that the owner is harvesting the trees there?
No, that would have been essentially considered by the local assessor as recreational land. In the DOR property system, it's called forest land, but its tax value is based on a fair market value, and the fair market value is driven by recreational land development.
Well, even in an area like that?
Sure, yep. Other questions? Yes?
Steve, just to continue on the previous question, that's one view that we don't typically have access to. Not a single county allows the public to see maps of land values and see all those stark contrasts. In all the years of looking at maps at WLIA, I've only seen one person bring such maps, and they didn't get published anywhere. So we're going to build a statewide parcel layer. We're going to be able to look at land value by class. It's going to be fun.
Indeed, there have been, in my memory, at least 3 different times when Department of Revenue said that they were going to build a statewide assessed value layer. It has yet to emerge. Maybe it will this time around.
You can on the county level, can't you?
Some counties you can, yes. One more question in the back there.
When you were talking about Dane County's food usage by acreage there, you came up with 140,000 acres. Was that just for human consumption, or were you considering the agricultural consumption for the cattle in there?
No, that was just human consumption. Well, actually, it included land for beef production, did not include the dairy production. So, those calculations are back of the envelope with some pretty major assumptions that go into it. Okay, I think we've run out of time here.